Folk etymology. The addition of the H to umble is an example of what's known as folk etymology. Somebody who didn't know what an umble was, saw the words umble pie, got confused. Then they saw that umble pie was a humble dish, assumed that somebody had just missed off the H and decided to put it back. Thus, umble pie becomes humble pie, and that's folk etymology. A duckling is a little duck, and a gosling is a little goose, and a darling is a little deer. And on the same principle, a little fellow who stood at an important chap's side used to be known as a sidling. Then the origin of the word sidling was forgotten, and in the 17th century people decided that it must be a participle of a verb, just as leaping and sleeping are participles of leap and sleep. There was only one problem with this theory. There didn't seem to be a verb to fit the noun, so one was invented. And from then on, a sidling became somebody who sidled. These days, there aren't nearly as many lords and servant boys, and so sidling itself has vanished. People still sidle around and sidle up to each other, but they're able to do so only because of a mistake of folk etymology and the back formation of a new word. Another common form of folk etymology happens when people alter the spelling of a strange or unfamiliar word so that they appear to make more sense. For example, there's a drowsy little rodent that the French used to call a dormeuse, which means she who sleeps. In English, we call the same creature a dormouse. That's despite the fact that it isn't a mouse and has no particular affinity for doors. The reason is that the English had field mice and town mice, and so they were, of course, going to look at the word dormeuse and conclude that someone just didn't know how to spell. The same principle applies to fairies, or rather to the disappearance of fairies. Once upon a time, belief in fairies was commonplace. They lived not at the bottom of the garden, but in the woods, where they'd play all sorts of mysterious games. They would milk people's cattle by night, or hide flowers under trees, and generally do the sorts of things that would get you or me arrested. They were known as the folks. When it was cold, the folks liked to wear gloves, which is why there is, or used to be, a flower called folks' glove. But the fairies have all died, or maybe just got better hidden, and people stopped referring to them as folks many years ago, which is why the name folks' glove became rather peculiar. And then some clever fellow decided that they weren't folks' gloves after all. They must be fox gloves, because foxes have such dinky little feet. And the error set in. Because there are foxgloves now, and foxgloves they will remain until somebody makes a better mistake. By the same system, the old word crevice is now spelled and pronounced crayfish, even though it's not very fish-like. The Spanish cucaracha became cockroach. And most wonderfully of all, the Indian mangus became a mongoose, although there's not a huge similarity between the furry, snake-devouring mammal and a goose. An exception to these folk etymologies is the butterfly. Butterflies do have something to do with butter, although nobody's quite sure what. They like to flutter around milk pails and butter churns, which might explain it. Many butterflies are yellow, which would be a good reason for the name, but there's another, more troubling possibility. Butterflies, like the rest of us, are subject to the call of the lavatory, and butterfly poo is yellow, just like butter. Now you may ask yourself, what sort of person goes around peering at butterfly poo and then naming an insect after it? The answer, it would appear, is that Dutch people do that. Or at least an old Dutch word for butterfly was boterscheit. Of course, you may dismiss that last theory as poppycock, but if you do, please remember, poppycock comes from the Dutch papakak, meaning soft shit. Before the next link, can you guess what butterflies have to do with psychiatry and pasta? Butterflies of the world. For some reason, the languages of the world put more effort into the names of butterflies than those of any other creature. From Norway to Malaysia, the words are extraordinary. Malay doesn't have plurals like ours. In English, you simply add an S to the end of the word, but in Malay, you form your plural by repeating the noun. So tables will become table, table. It's a system with some sort of logic to it. When there's more than one word, that means there's more than one thing. Works out fine for the speaker of Malay, so long as the original singular noun wasn't formed by the reduplication of itself, as is the case with their butterflies. The Malay for butterfly is Rama Rama. So butterflies is Rama 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 Rama. And it doesn't stop there. The Malays also repeat verbs to intensify them. So I really like would be rendered as I like, or suka suka. We occasionally do this in English when somebody says, I've got to see that film, all of which means that the Malay for I love butterflies is saya suka suka, rama rama, rama rama. In Italian, butterflies are called farfalli, and there's a kind of butterfly-shaped pasta named after them that you can buy in most supermarkets. Outside Italy, though, most people don't realise that it's butterfly pasta, and in America they ignore the Italian name entirely and call farfalli bow ties, because a butterfly resembles a bow tie, and in an emergency could probably serve as a substitute. And this is a point of dress not lost upon the Russians, who call a bow tie a butterfly. And as butterfly is in Russian a little lady, bow ties, butterflies and girls are all called babushkas, like babushkas. In the bleak Norwegian winter, there are no butterflies at all, so when they emerge from their chrysalises in the bleak Norwegian summer, they're called summer birds, or sommerfugel. In French, they rather boringly just took the Latin papilio and called the butterflies papillon. And then in a fit of inventiveness, they realised that the grand tents in which kings sat at tournaments and jousts were shaped like the wings of a butterfly, so they called them papillons. And we call them pavilions, which means that there's a butterfly at one end of Lord's cricket ground. Why all these intricate and exquisite names? Nobody bothers with the humble fly, which does exactly what it says on the tin, or the beetle, bitter, or the bee, quiverer, or the lazily named louse. Butterflies hog all the attention of the word makers. Perhaps this is because in many quite distinct and unconnected cultures, the butterfly is imagined to be a human soul that has shaken off this mortal coil of woes and now flutters happily through a gaily coloured afterlife. This was the belief of the Maoris and of the Aztecs, in whose mythology Itzpapalotl was the goddess of the obsidian butterfly, a soul encased in stone who could be freed only by another tongue-twisting god called Tezcatlipoca. There also seems to have been a ghost of this belief among the ancient Greeks. The Greek for butterfly was Psyche, and Psyche was the goddess of the soul. There's a lovely allegorical poem about her called Cupid and Psyche, and she's also the origin of the study of the soul, psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis and the release of the butterfly. The great thing about creating something is that you get to give it a name. Who would endure the expense and incontinence of babies were it not for the fun of saddling another human being with a name that you chose yourself? With this in mind, one can imagine Sigmund Freud sitting in his study in Vienna and considering Psyche, the Greek goddess of the soul and mystical butterfly. That's what he was analysing, with the stress on the first two syllables. So he decided to call his new invention psychoanalysis. Analysis is Greek for release, so Freud's new art would be literally the liberation of the butterfly. How pretty. Freud was probably so pleased with himself that he became lazy, for most of the other psychological terms are Jungian. Carl Jung was Freud's protégé. Then one day Carl had a dream that wasn't about sex. He hesitated before telling Freud something quite that embarrassing. Confessing to a psychoanalyst that you've had an innocent dream is rather like confessing to your grandmother that you've had a dirty one. Freud was outraged. What sort of fruitcake, he demanded, has a dream that isn't dirty? It was inconceivable. Freud decided that Jung had gone quite mad, that the dream really had been dirty and that Jung was just being coy. Jung insisted that his dream wasn't about sex and that in fact it was about his grandparents being hidden in a cellar. So he rejected Freud's pansexualism and ran off and became a Jungian. Having invented his own form of psychoanalysis, Jung now had naming rights. So it was Carl, not Sigmund, who decided that a psychological problem could be called a complex. Then he thought up introverts and extroverts, and finally, realizing that naming was a doddle, he invented synchronicity and ambivalent. And with that he sat down to rest on his laurels and consider his subterranean grandparents. But the grand panjandrum and greatest inventor of psychological terms was neither Sigmund Freud nor Carl Jung. It was a man who was just as important, but far less known today, Richard von Kraft Ebbing. Kraft Ebbing was born 16 years before Dr. Freud and 35 years before Jung. He was essentially the first doctor to start writing case histories of people whose sexual behaviour wasn't entirely respectable. The book that resulted, Psychotic Sexualities, in 1886, was so scandalous that large chunks of it had to be written in Latin in order to keep it out of the hands of the prurient public. The idea was that if you were clever enough to understand Latin, you couldn't possibly be a pervert. Because Kraft Ebbing was a pioneer, he had to invent terms left, right and centre. Humanity had a long history of condemning peccadillos, but not of classifying them. So it was in the translation of Psychopathia Sexualis that English first got the words homosexual, heterosexual, necrophilia, frotteur, anilingus, exhibitionism, sadism and masochism. Sadism had in fact been around for a while in French. The French writer Donatien Alphonse François Marquis de Sade was famous for producing horrid books about people being horrid to each other in bed. Really horrid. Catchy titles like 120 Days of Sodom should give you some idea. But a clearer image of the nature of Sade's work came from the fact that in the 1930s, a historian by the name of Geoffrey Gora, who was researching the Marquis, went to the British Museum to read some of de Sade's works that were stored there. However, he was told by the British Museum that it was a rule that people were only allowed to read de Sade's books in the presence of the Archbishop of Canterbury and 2 other trustees. So it's easy to see how de Sade's notoriety meant that his favourite activity became known as sadism in French. But Richard von Kraft Ebbing also needed a name for sadism's opposite, masochism. Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, who gave us the word masochism, is known to few or less. It seems rather appropriate. While the Marquis de Sade strides around spanking fame's bottom with a hardback copy of the 120 Days of Sodom, little Leo is forgotten in some ratty cellar, wearing a gimp suit and whimpering over a copy of Venus in Furs. Venus in Furs, written in 1870, was Massoch's great work. It describes a chap called Severin, who signs a contract with a lady, and use the term loosely, who is thereby entitled not only to punish her slave as she deems best, even for the slightest inadvertence or fault, but also is herewith given the right to torture him as the mood may seize her, or merely for the sake of whiling away the time. As you can imagine, Venus in Furs would make a splendid book group read or christening present. Yet even Masoch's masterwork is better known these days as a song by the Velvet Underground, whose lyrics have a fragile connection to the original novel, mainly in the use of the name Severin. Venus in Furs was rather closely based on Leo's own life. Masoch met a girl with the ridiculous name of Fanny Pistor. They signed just such a contract as the one above, and set off to Florence together, with him pretending to be her servant. Exactly how much time Fanny Pistor whiled away and how is not recorded, and it's probably best not to try to imagine. When in 1883 Kraft Ebbing was casting around for a name for a newly classified perversion, he thought of Sacher Masoch's novel. He wrote in Psychotic Sexualities that I feel justified in calling this sexual anomaly Masochism because the author Sacher Masoch frequently made this perversion, which up to his time was quite unknown to the scientific world as such, the substratum of his writings. He was a gifted writer, and as such would have achieved real greatness had he been actuated by normal sexual feelings. Poor Leo was still alive when Kraft Ebbing appropriated his name for a psychological disorder. He was, apparently, peeved by the terminology. Mind you, he probably rather enjoyed the humiliation. The villains of the language. History is written by the victors. The Elizabethan poet Sir John Harrington once wrote, "Treason doth never prosper, what's the reason? Why, if it prosper, none dare call it treason." But history is a lot fairer than language. Language takes your name and applies it to whatever it likes. Sometimes, however, it is fair, as with the word quizzling. Vidkun Quizzling was a Norwegian maths prodigy and invented his own religion. He also embarrassed himself during the Second World War by trying to get Norway to surrender to the Nazis so that he could be the puppet minister-president. He succeeded in his plan, and 10 weeks after his appointment, the Times wrote, "Major Quizzling has added a new word to the English language. To writers, the word quizzling is a gift from the gods. If they had been ordered to invent a new word for traitor, they could hardly have hit upon a more brilliant combination of letters. Orally, it contrives to suggest something at once slippery and tortuous. Visually, it has the supreme merit of beginning with a Q, which, with one august exception, has long seemed to the British mind to be a crooked, uncertain, and slightly disreputable letter, suggestive of the questionable, the querulous, the quavering of quaking quagmires and quivering quicksands, of quibbles and quarrels, of queasiness, quackery, qualms, and quilp." And it serves him right. However, language isn't always on the side of justice. Consider these three names: Guillotine, Derrick, and Jack Robinson. Which of those do you think was the nasty one? Two executioners and a doctor. Once upon a time, hanging was the punishment for almost any crime. Even the great Elizabethan poet Ben Jonson, for the trivial offence of murder, was sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted when Jonson proved that he could read and thus got benefit of the clergy. Instead of being executed, he had a T branded on his thumb and was sent home with a warning. The T stood for Tyburn, which is where the hangings used to take place. We even know the name of the man who would have hanged Ben Jonson. He was called Thomas Derrick. Thomas Derrick was a nasty man. There hadn't been enough applicants for the role of executioner, and so the Earl of Sussex pardoned a rapist on condition that he'd take on the job. That rapist was Derrick. Derrick was a bad man, but a good executioner. The two are probably connected. In fact, Derrick was something of an innovator. Rather than just slinging the rope over the beam, he invented a complicated system of ropes and pulleys. He even, in 1601, executed the Earl of Essex, though being a noble, Essex was allowed the dubious honour of having his head chopped off rather than hanging. There's a moral in that, but I haven't the foggiest notion what it is, and the ethics get more complicated when you consider that Derrick's name survives and Essex's doesn't. The rope system he invented started to be used for loading and unloading goods down at the docks, and that's why modern cranes still have a derrick. It's named after a rapist and an executioner. There's no justice in this world. Look at Jack Robinson. There are three main theories on why things happen before you can say Jack Robinson. The first is that Robinson used to be the French term for an umbrella, because of Robinson Crusoe, in which the hero has an umbrella and very little else. And that French servants were usually called Jacques. This meant that when rich Frenchmen visited England and were surprised by the inevitable shower of rain, they would shout, "Jacques Robinson!" There is, though, no evidence for this theory at all. The second theory is that there was an eccentric fellow in early 19th century London who would walk out of parties without warning, often before you could even say his name, which was Jack Robinson. However, there's no contemporary evidence for this strange Jack Robinson's existence, so the second theory looks as dicey as the first. The third and most plausible theory is that the phrase comes from Sir John Robinson, who definitely existed and was Constable of the Tower of London from 1660 to 1679. He was therefore in charge of executions and was a stickler for efficiency rather than solemnity. The prisoner was marched out, put on the block, and shortened, without any opportunity for famous last words or blubbering. He didn't even have time to appeal to the overseer of the execution. He was beheaded before he could say Jack Robinson. So, derricks and brief spans of time were both named after cruel and psychotic executioners. The guillotine, on the other hand, was named after a jolly nice chap. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine had nothing whatsoever to do with the invention of the guillotine. In fact, so far as anybody can tell, he was against the death penalty. In fact, so far as anybody can tell, nobody's sure who designed the first modern guillotine, but we know that it was built by a German harpsichord maker called Tobias Schmidt. It was Guillotine's kindness that got the machine named after him. You see, in pre-revolution France, poor people were hanged, whereas nobles had the right to be beheaded, which was considered less painful, though it's uncertain how they worked that out. So when the poor of France rose in revolution, one of their key demands was the right to be decapitated. Dr. Guillotine was on the committee for reforming executions. He decided that hanging was horrid and that axes were inefficient. However, a new-fangled mechanism from Germany was probably the least painful and most humane method available, if there had to be executions. It was best that they would be done with this new device, and he recommended it. In the debate that followed, on 1st of December 1789, Dr. Guillotine made one silly remark. "Avec ma machine," he said, "je vous fais sauter la tête d'un coup d'œil, et vous ne souffrez point." Which means, with my machine, I cut off your head in the twinkling of an eye, and you never feel it. The Parisians loved this line. They thought it was hilarious. In fact, they composed a comic song about it, and thus Dr. Guillotine's name was attached to one of the most famous methods of execution. Thomas Derrick and Jack Robinson were both sadistic, heartless thugs, whose names live on in innocence, if not glory. Poor Dr. Guillotine's family was so embarrassed that they had to change their surname. There's no justice. And sometimes with these eponymous inventions, it can be hard to work out which came first, the word or the man. And this is the case with Thomas Crapper, who invented the crapper. Thomas Crapper. There's a myth that the word crap was coined for the sake of Thomas Crapper, the inventor of the flushing lavatory. There's also a myth that the word crap was not coined for Thomas Crapper. It actually depends on where you come from. And if that sounds odd, it's because crap is a sticky subject. Luckily, I have, as it were, immersed myself in it. The first mistake that must be wiped away is that Thomas Crapper, who lived from 1836 to 1910, was the inventor of the lavatory. He wasn't. The first flushing lavatory was invented by the Elizabethan poet Sir John Harrington. Sir John installed his invention in his manor at Kelston, Somerset, where it's said that it was used by Queen Elizabeth herself. Harrington was so pleased with the device that he wrote a book on the subject called A New Discourse upon a Stale Subject, The Metamorphosis of Ajax. Ajax gets in there because in Elizabethan times, the slang word for a privy was Ajax. Ajax, Ajax. A whiff of the book's style and of the previous state of English crapping can be gained from the following extract. 4. When I found not only in mine own poor confused cottage, but even in the goodliest and stateliest palaces of this realm, notwithstanding all our provisions of vaults, of sluices, of grates, of panes of poor folks, in sweeping and scouring, yet still this same whoreson saucy stink, though he were commanded on pain of death not to come within the gates, yet would spite of our noses, even when we would gladliest have spared his company. Now, because the most unavoidable of all these things that keep such a stinking stir, or such a stink when they be stirred, is urine and ordure, that which we all carry about us, a good speculation to make us remember what we are and whither we must. Therefore, as I said before, many have devised remedies for this in times past, but yet, as the ape does his young ones, I think mine the properest of them all. Americans like to talk about going to the John, and it has been suggested this is in memory of John Harrington. Unfortunately, that's unlikely, as John, in the lavatorial sense, didn't appear until more than 100 years after Harrington's death. However, it is likely that John was an alteration of Jake. Or perhaps we just like giving boys' names to the smelliest room in the house. Harrington's invention didn't catch on. Unless there are sewers and running water, a flushing lavatory is never really going to be viable for the mass market. It's like having an electric lamp without mains electricity, or skis without snow. Sewers and running water arrived in Britain in the mid-19th century, and what we generally think of as a lavatory was patented by Edward Jennings in 1852. So who was Crapper? Thomas Crapper was born in Yorkshire in 1836. In 1853, a year after Jennings's patent, he came to London to start an apprenticeship as a plumber. He was jolly good at plumbing, and in the 1850s, it was the golden age of the toilet trader. The new sewers meant that everyone could flush away their shame and smell, and business boomed. Crapper set up his own company, Thomas Crapper & Co., and designed his own line of thrones. He invented the ballcock system for refilling, which stopped water being wasted, and added extra devices to stop anything unpleasant flowing back into the bowl after the flush. His were very superior lavatories, the pinnacle of plumbing. Crapper lavatories were chosen for the residence of the Prince of Wales and for the plumbing of Westminster Abbey, where Crapper's name can be seen to this day on the manhole covers. The brand name Crapper was everywhere, but crap had been around for a long time before. All the dictionaries claim that crap first appeared in the 1840s, but in fact the word can be traced back to 1801 and a poem by a fellow called J. Churchill. Churchill's poem tells a story which it claims is based on fact, about a subaltern in the army who feels the call of nature. He runs to the outhouse only to find that a major is already there, and as the major outranks him, he's forced to wait. The subaltern feels himself beginning to give way, and his misery is compounded when a captain turns up and pulls rank. Just adding, for some only mind number one, I shall go in when the major has done. The sub, who was now a most terrible plight in, and not quite aware of priority shiting, squeezed a while. Well, says he, then the best friends must part. Crap, 'twas a moist one, a right brewer's shite. And finding it in vain, he stopped to be stopping the lake. Zoon, says he, then here goes man, I've brewed, so I'll bake. That beautiful poem was written 35 years before Thomas Crapper was born and half a century before he started plumbing, so Crap is certainly not named after Crapper. Perhaps it was a case of nominative determinism. If you're unfortunate enough to be called Crapper, what are you going to be doing except work with it? However, if Crapper didn't cause crap, he associated himself with it closely. All of his lavatories had Thomas Crapper and Co. written on them in florid writing, and these lavatories were installed all over Britain. But in America, reference to crap all through the 19th century, nobody had ever heard of either Crapper, the man, or crap the word. There isn't an American reference to crap any time in the 19th century. In fact, there's nothing before the First World War. Then in 1917, America declared war on Germany and sent 2.8 million men across the Atlantic, where they would have been exposed to the ubiquitous Thomas Crapper and Co. on every second lavatory. It's only after the First World War that crap, crapper, crapping around, crapping about appear in the United States. So it would seem that although the English word crap doesn't come from the man, the American one does. Crapper didn't invent it, but he spread the word. Mythical acronyms. Can you take another chapter on the same subject? Good. Because we have something to clear up. Shit and fuck. Or more precisely, shit and fuck. You might have heard the story that both these words are acronyms. This is absolute twaddle. S-H-I-T, F-U-C-K. The story goes that manure gives off methane. So far, so true. But then the story continues that when manure is transported on a ship, it needs to be stored right at the top of the boat to stop the methane building up to explosive levels in the cargo hold. So the words "store high in transit" used to be stamped on bags of manure when they were loaded into a boat. Store high in transit then got shortened to its initials, S-H-I-T, and that was the start of shit. It's an ingenious explanation, and whoever thought it up at least deserves credit for imagination. Unfortunately, it's absolute manure. Shit can be traced back to the Old English verb skitan, which actually meant exactly what it does today, and further back to Proto-Germanic skit. The Germans still say Scheiße. And all the way to the Proto-Indo-European word, around 4000 BC, sky, which means to separate or divide, presumably on the basis that you separated yourself from your feces. Shed, as in shed your skin, comes from the same root, and so does schism. An odd little aspect of this etymology is that when Proto-Indo-European arrived in the Italian peninsula, they used sky to mean separate or distinguish, if you could tell two things apart when you knew them, and so the Latin word for know became scire. From that you got the Latin word scientia, which meant knowledge. And from that we got the word science. This means that science is etymologically shit. It also means that knowing your shit etymologically means that you're good at physics and chemistry. Also, as conscience comes from the same root, the phrase, "I don't give a shit," is thoroughly appropriate. The other acromonic myth that we need to stamp out is that fuck is a legal term. The commonly believed myth runs that once upon a time, when sex could land you in jail, people could be taken to court and charged for unlawful carnal knowledge. Nothing of the sort is true, and there's never been such a term in English law. The first recorded fuckers were actually monks. There was a monastery in the English city of Ely, and in an anonymous 15th century poem, somebody mentioned that the monks might have acquired some dirty habits. The poem is in a strange combination of Latin and English, but the lines with which we are concerned run thus: Non sunt in caeli qui fuccant vives in heli, which seems to mean they are not in heaven who fuck wives in Ely. The modern spelling of fuck is first recorded in 1535, and this time it's bishops who are at it. According to a contemporary writer, bishops may fuck their fill and be unmarried. In between those two, there's a brief reference to the master of Brasenose College, Oxford, to a fucking abbot. So it seems that the rules of celibacy weren't being taken too seriously in the medieval church. Some scholars, though, trace the word fuck to even earlier roots. The etymologist Karl Buck claims to have found a man from 1278 who rejoiced in the name John le Fucker, but nobody's since been able to find the reference, and some even suspect that Buck made it up as a joke. Also, even if John le Fucker did ever exist, he was probably really called John le Fulcher or John the Soldier. Acronyms are, I'm afraid, mainly myths. Posh does not mean port out, starboard home, and wog never stood for wily oriental gentleman. There was a famous cabal formed of Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley and Lauderdale. All conspired against Charles II, but that was coincidence. The word had already been around for centuries, C-A-B-A-L. But some acronyms do exist, just not where you might expect to find them. There's one hidden away in the Sound of Music that relates straight back to John the Baptist. John the Baptist and the Sound of Music. About 2,000 years ago, a perfectly respectable lady called Elizabeth became pregnant, and her husband lost his voice. He stayed silent as a silo until the child was born. The child was called John, and when John grew up, he began telling people that they were naughty and chucking them in a river. Now, if you or I tried a stunt like that, we'd be brought up by the police pretty sharpish. But John got away with it, and if you can believe it, was considered rather holy for all his attempted drownings. Chaps at the time called him John the Baptist. 700 years later, somebody else lost his voice, or at least had a terribly sore throat. He was an Italian who went by the cumbersome moniker of Paul the Deacon. So he wrote a verse prayer to John the Baptist that ran thus: Ut queant laxis resonare febris, mira gestorum famuli tuorum, solve polluti labi reatum Sancte Johannes, which means, O let your servants sing your wonders on, with lucent voice and sinless lips, St. John. 400 years after that, in the 14th century, somebody set this little poem to music. Or maybe she wrote a pretty climbing melody in which each line started a note higher than the last, until with the words Sancte Johannes it dropped again to the bottom. So the first note was on the syllable ut. The second line began with the re in resonare on the note above, then mi in mira, fa, so, la. The problem with ut, though, is that it's rather a short syllable and difficult for a singer to hold. Try it. Ut. So ut got changed to do, perhaps for dominus, but nobody's sure. And that gave do, re, mi, fa, so, la, and by extension, si for Sancte Johannes. Then somebody pointed out there was already a so beginning with S, so you couldn't rightly have two lines beginning with the same letter. So si was changed to ti. Do, re, mi, fa, so, la, ti, do, which is just a shortening of a hymn to John the Baptist. The shortening technique was invented by a fellow called Guido of Arezzo. So do is not a deer, a female deer, and Ray is not a drop of golden sun. The fond trapped family were cruelly deceived. Poor Ut was consigned to history, or nearly. It sort of survives. The lowest note was also known as gamma, after the Greek letter. So the lowest note of the scale was once known as gamma or Ut. Then a whole scale came to be known as gamma Ut. And that's why when you go through the whole scale, you still run through the gamut. It all comes back to church music, rather like organised crime, which is, of course, crime played on a church organ. Organic, organised organs. Organic food is food grown in a church organ. Organised crime is crime committed by organists. Well, etymologically speaking. Once upon a time the Greeks had the word organon, which meant something you work with. And organon would be a tool, an implement, a musical instrument, or a part of the body. For the moment, let's stick to the musical sense. Originally, an organ was any musical instrument, and this was still the case when in the 9th century people decided that every church should have a pipe organ in it. For, as Dryden put it, what human voice can reach the sacred organ's praise. Slowly the pipe part of pipe organ got dropped, and other instruments ceased to be organs except the mouth organ, which, if you think about it, sounds a bit rude. And that's why an organ is now only the musical instrument you have in a church. Now, let's return to the Greeks, because organ continued to mean a thing you work with, and hence a part of the body, as in the old joke, why did Bach have 20 children? Because he had no stops on his organ. A bunch of organs put together make up an organism, and things that are produced by organisms are therefore organic. In the 20th century, when artificial fertilizers were strewn upon our not green enough fields, we started to distinguish between this method and organic farming, and thus organic food. The human body is beautifully and efficiently arranged, at least my body is. Each organ has a particular function. I have a hand to hold a glass, a mouth to drink with, a belly to fill, a liver to deal with the poison, and so on and so forth. Head, heart, lungs, liver, kidney, and colon, each performs a particular task, and the result, dear reader, is the glory that is I. If you arrange a group of people and give each one a particular job, you are, metaphorically, making them act together like the organs of a body. You are organising them. Thus, an organisation. Something in which each person, like each organ of the body, has a particular task. And that shift in meaning happened in the 16th century, when everybody liked metaphors about the body politic. However, crime didn't get organised until 1929 in Chicago, when Al Capone was running the mob, or mobile vulgus, to give it its proper name. Mob is only a shortening. Clipping. When a phrase like mobile vulgatus, or mobile peasants, gets shortened to mob, linguists call it clipping. And there are more clips around than you might think. Taxicab, taximeter, cabriolet. Fan, fanatic. Bus, voiture omnibus. Wilco, will comply. Van, caravan. Sleuth, sleuth hound, a kind of sniffer dog. Butch, butcher. Cute, acute. Sperm whale, spermaceti whale. Film buff, buffalo. Buffalo. How did buffalo come to mean enthusiast? What's the connection between the beast and the music buff? To answer that, you first need to know that buffalo aren't buffalo, and also that buffalo is one of the most curious words in the English language. The ancient Greek word boubalos was applied to some sort of African antelope. Then boubalos was changed to buffalo and applied to various kinds of domesticated oxen. That's why you still have water buffalo, bubalos bubalis, and any ox in Europe could once be called a buffalo. Then the same thing happened to buffaloes that had happened to turkeys. Explorers arrived in North America, saw some bison, and wrongly assumed that they were the same species as the European ox. Biologically, they aren't related, and to this day scientists will become tetchy if you call a bison a buffalo, but who cares? The name stuck. Now let's jump back across the Atlantic and take another look at those European oxen. They were called buffalo, but the name was often shortened to buff. European buffalo used to get killed and skinned, and the leather that resulted was therefore known as buff, or buff leather. This leather was very useful for polishing, which is why we still buff things until they shine. When something's been properly buffed, it looks good. And from that we get the idea that people who spend too much time at the gym, running around like crazed gerbils, are buff. An odd thing about buff leather is that it's rather pale, and in fact looks very like human skin. And that's why naked people are referred to as being in the buff, because it looks as though they're dressed in buff leather. And some people really did dress in buff leather, as it's a good strong material. For example, in the 19th century, the uniform of the New York firefighters was made from buff, and the firefighters themselves were often called buffs. The firefighters of New York were heroes. Everybody loves a good conflagration, and whenever a New York building started burning, the buffs would be called, and crowds of New Yorkers would turn out to cheer them on. People would travel across the city just to see a good fire, and schoolboys would become aficionados of the buffs' techniques for putting them out. These devoted New York schoolboys became known as buffs. Thus the New York Sun said in 1903 that the buffs are men and boys whose love of fire, firefighting and firemen is a predominant characteristic. And that's why to this day you have film buffs and music buffs and other such expert buffaloes. On the far side of New York State, beside the Niagara River, is a whole city called Buffalo, which is a bit odd, as there aren't any bison there, and never have been. However, the Niagara River is very pretty, and the best guess about the origins of the city name is that Buffalo is a corruption of the French beau fleuve, or beautiful river. But imagine if there were bison in the city of Buffalo. Pigeons in London are called London pigeons. Girls in California are called California girls. So any bison that you found in Buffalo would have to be called Buffalo buffaloes. Buffaloes are big beasts, and it's probably best not to get into an argument with one. That's why there's an American slang verb, to buffalo, meaning to bully. This means that if you bullied bison from that large city of Niagara River, you would be buffaloing buffalo buffaloes. But you can go further, and a linguist at the University of Buffalo did. He worked out that if bison from his native city, who were bullied by another bison from his native city, went and took their frustration out on still other bison from his native city, then buffalo, 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 buffalo. Confused? The grammar's easier if you compare it to this version. Buffalo bison, whom buffalo bison bully, then bully buffalo bison. It's the longest grammatically correct sentence in the English language that uses only one word. Word buffs love it.